Three military helicopters landing outside a small restaurant during a devastating hurricane. Inside, a black chef cooking meals for flood victims has no idea his life is about to change forever. What did the military want with this humble chef? The answer will inspire you. Watch this incredible true story and subscribe to Seeds of Goodness for more heartwarming content. James Carter stood at the window of his restaurant, Soul Kitchen, watching as the rain pounded mercilessly against the glass. Hurricane Elena had been battering the Gulf Coast for 3 days, and while his restaurant sat on higher ground away from the worst flooding, much of the surrounding coastal city of Port Haven was underwater. At 42, James had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. Growing up in New Orleans, he'd survived Hurricane Katrina as a young man, an experience that had shaped his worldview permanently. That's why, when he'd opened Soul Kitchen 5 years ago, he'd chosen a location on high ground despite the higher rent. "It's bad out there, isn't it?" Marion, his sous chef, appeared beside him, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. James nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the television mounted in the corner of the bar area. The local news showed footage of rescue boats navigating what used to be residential streets, now transformed into murky rivers. Families huddled on rooftops, clutching plastic bags of belongings, waiting for help. "The east side is completely cut off," James said, pointing to the map on the screen. "That's where most of the evacuation centers are." Marion shook her head. "Those people must be starving." The word starving triggered something in James. He straightened his 6'3" frame and turned to survey his restaurant kitchen. A kitchen that was fully stocked, thanks to a delivery that had miraculously arrived just hours before the worst of the storm hit. "We have food," he said simply. "They need food." Marion gave him a knowing look. She'd worked alongside James long enough to recognize that tone. "What are you thinking, boss?" Instead of answering, James strode to the walk-in refrigerator and flung open the door, mentally cataloging its contents. Proteins, vegetables, dairy, enough to last through the week under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. He then moved to the dry storage area, counting bags of rice, beans, pasta, and flour. His mind was already calculating how many meals he could produce, what dishes would stretch the furthest while providing the most nourishment. "Boss," Marion prompted again. James turned to face her, decision made. "Call everyone who can safely get here. We're opening the kitchen, not for customers, but for the city." Within 2 hours, 6 of James's 12 staff members had made their way to Soul Kitchen, braving the treacherous conditions to answer their chef's call. They gathered in the kitchen, water dripping from raincoats and umbrellas, eyes wide with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Here's the situation," James explained, spreading a map of the city on the stainless steel prep table. "These areas are completely flooded. Evacuation centers are overwhelmed. Emergency services are stretched thin. People are hungry. And we have food." "How do we get it to them?" asked Derek, one of the line cooks. "Roads are blocked all over." "Oh." James pointed to the restaurant's delivery van parked out back. "We can reach some areas. For others, we'll have to coordinate with emergency services. But first, we cook." And cook they did. James orchestrated his small team with the precision and efficiency that had made Soul Kitchen one of the most respected restaurants in Port Haven. They prepared massive pots of gumbo, jambalaya, and red beans and rice, hearty, filling dishes that would provide comfort as well as nourishment. As the aromas filled the kitchen, James felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in years. Here, amid disaster, was clarity. By evening, they had prepared enough food to feed several hundred people. The challenge now was distribution. James loaded the first batch into the delivery van and, with Derek volunteering to navigate, set out for the nearest accessible shelter. The streets were apocalyptic. Fallen trees blocked some routes, while others had transformed into fast-moving streams. Several times, they had to turn back and find alternate paths. But eventually, they pulled up to the high school gymnasium that had been converted into an emergency shelter. The scene inside stunned them. Hundreds of people sat on cots or directly on the floor, many still in wet clothes, children crying, elderly people looking dazed. Red Cross volunteers moved among them, clearly overwhelmed. "We've brought food," James announced to the harried-looking woman who approached them. The relief on her face was immediate. "Oh, thank God. We've been trying to get supplies in for hours." Word of the hot meal spread quickly, and soon James and Derek were serving gumbo to a line of grateful residents. Each "thank you" strengthened James's resolve. This was why he'd become a chef, not for the accolades or the profitable weekend rushes, but to feed people, to provide comfort through food. By the time they returned to Soul Kitchen, it was past midnight. The team was exhausted but energized. They immediately began preparing for the next day, knowing the need would only grow. Over the next 3 days, James and his team fell into a rhythm. They cooked from dawn until mid-afternoon, then loaded the food into the van and any other vehicles they could press into service. They reached more shelters, and as word spread, people began coming directly to the restaurant. Families who had lost everything, first responders working around the clock, volunteers from out of town who had nowhere to eat. No one was turned away. James stretched the supplies as far as they would go, sometimes serving simpler meals as the refrigerated items were used up. He depleted his restaurant's reserves, then began using his personal savings to purchase whatever supplies he could from the few stores that had reopened. By the 5th day, the situation had become dire. Their resources were dwindling fast, and while the floodwaters had begun to recede in some areas, much of Port Haven remained underwater. The need for food had only increased as more people were rescued from isolated areas. James sat at the bar after closing, tallying figures in a worn notebook. The numbers were grim. At their current rate, they had enough supplies for perhaps one more day of meals. Marion sat beside him, understanding the weight on his shoulders. "We've helped a lot of people, James. Nobody would blame you if we had to stop." Before he could respond, the local news caught his attention again. A reporter stood outside Soul Kitchen. They must have filmed earlier that day, talking about the chef with a heart as big as his gumbo pot. The story showed footage of James serving food to flood victims, interviewed grateful recipients, and highlighted the restaurant's transformation into an emergency food center. Chef Carter estimates they've served over 5,000 meals in 5 days, the reporter said, operating entirely on their own resources and initiative. James watched, uncomfortable with the attention, but hopeful it might inspire others to help. He hadn't started this for recognition. As the news segment ended, James's phone rang, an unknown number with a military area code. "Mr. Carter, this is Captain Lisa Rodriguez with the National Guard Relief Operation." The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "We've heard about what you're doing, and we'd like to coordinate with you. We have resources that could help expand your efforts." James felt a flicker of hope. "We're running low on supplies. If you could help with that—" "We can do better than that," Captain Rodriguez interrupted. "My commanding officer would like to speak with you personally tomorrow. He's particularly interested in your operation." After arranging a meeting time, James hung up, puzzled but optimistic. He turned to Marion, a tired smile forming on his face. "Looks like we might be able to keep going after all." Little did James know that the next day would bring a surprise that would transform his modest relief effort into something he could never have imagined, and reunite him with a face from his past in the most unexpected of circumstances. Dawn broke over Port Haven, with the first clear sky in nearly a week. James arrived at Soul Kitchen earlier than usual, determined to make the most of their dwindling supplies. The meeting with the National Guard officer wasn't scheduled until noon, which gave him and his team time to prepare one more batch of meals. "We're down to rice, beans, and canned goods," Marion reported, surveying their depleted stores. "Maybe enough for 300 portions if we stretch it." James nodded, already tying his apron. "Then we make 300 portions. Let's focus on the senior center today. They haven't had a delivery since yesterday morning." The kitchen came alive as the team worked with practiced efficiency, transforming simple ingredients into flavorful, nourishing meals. Despite their exhaustion from days of non-stop cooking, there was a sense of purpose that energized their movements. At 11:30, as they were packing the meals into containers, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors thundered overhead, growing louder until the building seemed to vibrate with their force. "That's not just one helicopter," Derek said, rushing to the window. Outside, not one but three massive UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were descending toward the empty parking lot across from the restaurant. Each bore the insignia of the U.S. Army National Guard. The downdraft from their rotors sent debris scattering and forced onlookers to shield their faces. "What in the world?" James murmured, stepping outside as the first helicopter touched down. The side door slid open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in combat fatigues emerged, followed by several soldiers carrying equipment. The officer spotted James immediately and strode toward him with purpose, his bearing unmistakably military, despite the smile spreading across his face. "Chef Carter," he called out over the diminishing rotor noise, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Michael Reynolds, 223rd Engineering Battalion, National Guard." James shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip. "Yes, that's me. I wasn't expecting quite such an entrance, Colonel." Reynolds laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, I wanted to make sure I had your attention." His expression grew more serious. "What you've been doing here is remarkable, Chef. 5,000 meals in 5 days with limited resources? That's the kind of logistical miracle the military appreciates." As they talked, soldiers were unloading large containers from the helicopters. Medical teams had also emerged and were setting up what looked like a triage area in the parking lot. "We're establishing a forward operating base for disaster relief," Reynolds explained, following James's gaze. "Medical services, supply distribution, coordination center. But we need to talk about you specifically." Inside Soul Kitchen, Reynolds surveyed the modest operation with expert eyes while his aide-de-camp spread maps across one of the dining tables. "You've been reaching these areas," Reynolds said, indicating the marked shelters on the map. "But there are communities here, and here that remain completely cut off by road." He pointed to several isolated neighborhoods. "We have the airlift capability to reach them, but we lack the food preparation infrastructure." James leaned forward, studying the map. "How many people are we talking about?" "Approximately 7,000 still in their homes or in makeshift shelters," Reynolds replied. "FEMA is bringing in MREs, but those are barely food," James finished, having tasted military meals ready to eat during a cooking demonstration for veterans years ago. Reynolds smiled ruefully. "Exactly. What these people need is real food. Hot food. The kind of food that reminds them they haven't been forgotten." He straightened and looked James directly in the eye. "Which brings me to our proposal." The colonel outlined an audacious plan. The National Guard would provide supplies, equipment, and transportation to turn Soul Kitchen into the central food preparation hub for the entire disaster zone. Military personnel would assist with cooking under James's direction, and helicopters would deliver meals to areas unreachable by road. "We're prepared to supply enough food for 10,000 meals a day for the next 30 days, Reynolds said, letting the number hang in the air. "All we need is your expertise and your kitchen." James was stunned. "Why me? Why not set up your own field kitchen?" Reynolds was quiet for a moment, seeming to debate something internally. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, sliding it across the table. James picked it up, and recognition dawned slowly. The photo showed a much younger version of himself in chef whites, standing next to a younger Reynolds in desert camouflage. Behind them was a makeshift kitchen tent, with a sign that read, "Forward Operating Base Falcon, Baghdad." "You were a contractor," James said, memories flooding back. "At the base in Iraq, 2008. Reynolds nodded. "I was a captain then. You ran the officers' mess for 6 months. He tapped the photo. "You probably served thousands of soldiers, so you might not remember, but you made a difference to me personally." He described how James had gone out of his way to prepare a special meal for Reynolds when he'd received news of his father's death, unable to return home for the funeral due to ongoing operations. That meal, It wasn't just food. It was care, in a place where that was hard to find. Reynolds's voice grew quiet. I never forgot it. Or you. James remembered now. The young captain, grief-stricken but holding it together for his men. The off-menu meal James had prepared, Southern comfort food that reminded Reynolds of home. When I saw the news report about what you were doing here, Reynolds continued, I knew it was the same man, the same spirit, and I knew we had to help you scale this operation. Before James could respond, one of the soldiers appeared at the door. Colonel, the first supply trucks are 10 minutes out. Reynolds raised an eyebrow at James. I hope that's not presumptuous. I had a feeling you'd say yes. James looked around at his exhausted team, who had gathered to listen. He saw in their faces the same determination that had driven them all week, now mingled with hope at the prospect of help. Where do we start? James asked. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, military trucks arrived with industrial cooking equipment, generators, refrigeration units, and enough food to fill 3 restaurants. National Guard personnel in culinary specialties reported for duty, ready to work under James's direction. By evening, the kitchen that had struggled to produce 300 meals was now capable of thousands. The first helicopter deliveries went out at dusk, carrying hot food to communities that had received nothing but airdrops of bottled water for days. James stood on the roof of Soul Kitchen, watching as the Blackhawks lifted off into the sunset, each loaded with containers that would bring not just nourishment, but hope to isolated survivors. Beside him, Colonel Reynolds surveyed their operation with quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow will be even bigger, Reynolds said. Word's spreading about what we're doing here. Indeed, local media had already dubbed it Operation Soul Kitchen, and national outlets were picking up the story. But for James, the most meaningful moment had come hours earlier, when he'd served the first meal to an elderly woman at the senior center, her eyes lighting up at the sight of real food, prepared with care rather than simply assembled from packages. Thank you, Chef, she'd said, grasping his hand. This reminds me we haven't been forgotten. As darkness fell over the still flooded city, lights powered by military generators illuminated Soul Kitchen like a beacon. Inside, preparations for the next day were already underway, an improbable alliance of civilian chefs and military cooks working side by side, united by a single mission, to feed a city in need, one meal at a time. 2 weeks into Operation Soul Kitchen, the rhythm of the relief effort had evolved into a well-oiled machine. James moved through the expanded kitchen area, where military field equipment now stood alongside his restaurant's fixtures. National Guard culinary specialists worked shoulder to shoulder with his original team, preparing meals at a scale James had never imagined possible. 10,000 meals yesterday, Marion reported, clipboard in hand. And we've reached every isolated area on the map. The floodwaters had receded significantly, revealing the extent of the destruction, but also allowing more conventional aid to reach affected areas. Still, Operation Soul Kitchen continued at full capacity, providing hot, fresh food that stood in stark contrast to the standard disaster rations. What had begun as James's solitary act of compassion had grown beyond anything he could have envisioned. The parking lot resembled a military base, with supply trucks arriving daily and helicopters taking off on regular schedules. A tent city had sprung up behind the restaurant, housing volunteers who had traveled from across the country after hearing the story on national news. Chef Carter, called a voice, and James turned to see Colonel Reynolds approaching. Got a minute? They stepped outside, where the afternoon sun glinted off the Blackhawks parked nearby. In the distance, reconstruction efforts were visible, a city slowly healing. I've just been on a call with the Pentagon, Reynolds said. They're impressed with what we've accomplished here. The partnership between civilian expertise and military logistics has been more effective than traditional models. James nodded, watching as a helicopter lifted off, heading toward a still isolated community. It's worked because everyone checked their egos at the door. We all just wanted to help. That's exactly it, Reynolds agreed. And that's why they want to formalize this approach. They're calling it the Community Culinary Response Initiative. The idea is to identify restaurants in disaster-prone areas, provide advanced training and certification, and be ready to activate them as relief centers when needed. James turned to look at him. And they want Soul Kitchen to be the model? They want you to help develop the program, Reynolds corrected. Your experience here, combined with your background in Iraq, you understand both worlds in a way few people do. The offer was unexpected but somehow felt right, a perfect synthesis of James's culinary skills and his desire to serve his community. In the weeks that followed, as Port Haven gradually recovered, Operation Soul Kitchen gradually scaled back. The military presence diminished, with Black Hawks departing one by one, each send-off accompanied by a specially prepared meal from James and his team. On the final day of operations, exactly 1 month after James had first opened his kitchen to flood victims, a small ceremony was held. Representatives from FEMA, the military, and the city gathered to recognize what had been accomplished. Over 300,000 meals served, countless lives touched, and a new model for disaster response established. Mayor Garcia presented James with a key to the city. "Some heroes wear chef's whites," she said, to applause from the assembled crowd. But for James, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when Colonel Reynolds handed him an official-looking folder. "Your contract to serve as chief advisor to the Community Culinary Response Initiative," he explained. "If you accept, you'll be helping restaurants across the country prepare to do what you did here." James thought about the thousands of people fed, the gratitude in their eyes, the way food had become a lifeline during the darkest days after the hurricane. "I accept," he said simply, shaking Reynolds' hand. 6 months later, Soul Kitchen reopened its doors to regular customers, though it was hardly regular anymore. The walls were adorned with photos of Operation Soul Kitchen and thank you letters from those who had received meals. A glass display case held the first spatula James had used to serve food to flood victims, alongside the military patch Reynolds had given him as a token of their partnership. And in the kitchen, alongside the regular staff, 2 National Guard culinary specialists worked part-time, maintaining the connection between 2 worlds that had come together over a simple, powerful truth. When disaster strikes, food is more than sustenance. It is hope, served hot, 1 plate at a time.